And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Ryan Kralik, author, researcher, and remote viewer who suggests that all matter, life, and awareness are emergent from information that organizes itself towards stability and meaning. Ryan, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Thank you.
Ryan, let's start a little bit with your background and what led you into these theories.
Sure. How far back do you want to go?
Well, let's start with how did you get into remote viewing, and does that apply to this work?
Oh, that applies to this work, but I don't know that we can, I don't know if it does us justice to start there. I started remote viewing about 3 years ago.
Okay.
But what kind of started me on this path was when I was 11, I found out Santa Claus wasn't real. And that led to me, I come from a Catholic upbringing, and I went to Catholic school, and I don't know what your familiarity is with the Catholic tradition, but, there's a lot of structure and there's not generally a lot of questioning. That was my upbringing, is, this is what we say, and this is what we say the truth is. So I find out when I'm 11 that Santa Claus isn't real. And that was like an eye-opening experience for me, because Santa Claus, should probably say like send the kids out of the room or something now, but Santa Claus is, to a kid, it's the realest thing there is, right? Evidence every Christmas morning that he's there and he cares about you and all that. So I find out that there's no Santa Claus, and immediately I'm like, but wait a minute. There's a number of other things like that I've been told. Similar thing. They're fanciful stories that sound ridiculous in real life, but I'm told to believe them. And right around that same time, I also, I went to grade school, was a Catholic school, and then I went to public school starting in the 6th grade. And so then I go to public school, and all of a sudden, topics like science are different now. They're teaching evolution, and, human beings came from, evolved from other primates. And I remember I went and asked my priest, I'm like, what do you say about this? And so but that's where it began. So I'm like, 11, 12, 13 years old. I go to the library every single week. I bring home a stack of books on, topics like that, human evolution. And, by the time I'm in high school, I'm studying and trying to understand physics. And then there were always these topics that just fascinated me. So, I wouldn't, I just wouldn't miss anything. If there was something on TV about them, aliens and UFOs, and, we call them UAP now, but these were fascinating topics to me. So when I was a kid, I started studying them, and I never quit. There would be periods of time where I was, focused on other things more, but really for, over 30 years, this has been a part of my life, is trying to understand a number of these topics. And really fundamentally, they are physics, and specifically the things about physics that we seem to have a problem with understanding. Ancient civilizations was always a big one for me too. And I've studied both sides of that. I've read all the Graham Hancock books, and I've read all the, books by guys like Wilkinson and, the serious scholars of antiquity. So, and then religion was always a big one. Partly because of my upbringing, by the time I was 12, I was fully atheist, materialist, physicalist, reductionist, whatever you want to call it. I said, no, science seems to have the answer and religion seems to be completely wrong. And I was fully of that worldview until really just a couple of years ago. Really, it was until this happened that this framework that I've developed kind of came into existence. Prior to that, if science hasn't explained it yet, fine, but eventually it will if we keep looking. And there's just no place for that other stuff. And frankly, it's wrecking society. Was my view on it, and I haven't completely, gone the other way of seeing it that way. Jesus is not my savior, as it were, but I found I feel like I've found what it is, what it's for, why it's there, how it helps, and hopefully I've maybe started putting together what might be next. But that's really how I got into these topics.
You said until this happened. Was there an event that happened that brought you into the idea of the information first framework of reality?
Yes.
What was the event?
It was kind of two events. One that happened first and one that happened later. The first event was during COVID. I sold my company. Right, I'm in marketing and that field, and I had built a company, and around the time that COVID was kind of coming on, somebody offered to buy the company, and I sold it to them. I thought that's what you do. That's success. You built it, you sell it, you got a bunch of money. That's winning. And within a year, I was in like a deep depression. Probably for a lot of reasons, but I don't know what to do with myself, and I don't know what's next. I know that pile of money is going to, a pile of money that doesn't get added to gets subtracted from, right? And so just constant stress about it. And I ended up in a deep depression for a couple of years. I was bouncing around between psychiatrists, and I was on like 15 medications in 2 years, up to 5 at a time. And that's a lot. And it didn't make me better, it made me worse, right? I nearly lost a lot of great things as a result of that. But during that time, I was also, I was trying to occupy my mind with something that interests me. What I didn't realize at the time is what I was looking for was meaning, right? And so I'm reading, every Graham Hancock book again. And, I'm reading books about, all these, the stuff that's on your show. I'm reading about these things. And I end up getting a book called Penetration by Ingo Swann. And I had heard of remote viewing before. When I was in middle school, I read this book. It's a young adult title. And it was about these kids that were doing remote viewing experiments. It was interesting enough that I never forgot about it. I think I kind of always thought maybe there's something to that. But I'm reading Ingo's book, and I get to the end, and I don't quite know what to make of it, because I don't know if you've read that book, but it's weird. It's weird. And yet he seems to be mostly pretty confident that most of the things happened. He's remote viewing, people working on the moon, and aliens living and working on the moon and Mars and so on, which should sound patently ridiculous to somebody like me. But there was something about it that wasn't quite dismissible. So right after that, I started doing a little more research into the Army's remote viewing program, the Defense Department intelligence community program, funded under a number of different names. And, I started seeing some of the characters, drifting in and out of that play. And so I ordered another book called The Seventh Sense by Lynn Buchanan. And I'm reading that book, and it was on a Saturday morning. My kids were at their grandparents. So it's just me, my wife's outside drinking coffee. And I just had this moment about halfway through the book where I'm like, I can't do this. I'm going to drive myself even crazier with topics like this. If there's nothing to this, the smart thing to do would be to put this book down and go do something else. So I felt like I had a good enough understanding of, the remote viewing protocols just from having read these couple of books that I thought I could get through a rudimentary experiment. So I went to another room. My wife could not see what I was doing. She did not know what I was doing. I found something in a drawer. I wrapped it in a piece of paper. On that piece of paper, I wrote a 4-digit number. I put the item out of sight so she couldn't see it. And then I went outside where she was and I said, I need you to do something for me. Just do what I say for the next few minutes and don't ask me any questions and don't think, just do what I say. She says, okay. So I bring her in the house and I set her down. I put the paper and pen in front of her. I said, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you a 4-digit number. I want you to write it down on the paper. Then I want you to squiggle. Just make, whatever comes to mind, just squiggle it onto the paper, make some marks. And then I want you to tell me the words that come into your head that you know about the item in my pocket. I said, but don't tell me what's in my pocket. Just write down the words that describe what's in my pocket and don't use any nouns. She says, okay. So I give her the 4-digit number and she writes it down and then she makes the squiggle. And I said, okay, write down the words that describe what's in my pocket. And she writes down round, small, smooth, and green. I said, anything else? She said, no. I said, all right, now sketch what's in your mind that represents this item. And she draws a circle with 3 squiggly lines in the middle of it, right? And I reached in my pocket. It's a marble. It's a kid's marble. And it's smooth and it's round and it's small and it's green and blue. And what's a marble? You've seen a glass marble. Squiggly, right? So I have a different life after that in a lot of ways. So that was the first event, reductionist, materialist, atheist, science fearing person is going to have a hard time rationalizing that away. Now I had read books and seen videos and lectures and stuff from people who said this is real, who said that they do this, in some cases for a living, that the government at one point paid them to do it and spent money making sure that they could, understanding how it worked and so on. And when you do what I do for a living, I'm in marketing and sales. If I'm an expert at anything, it's that, right? Well, that means that I've sat across the table from, 10,000 plus people in a situation where we're reading each other and or trying to convince each other of something. So, and it also means I've read all the books that go along with when you do that for a living and understanding what motivates people. I'm pretty good at telling if somebody is not being truthful, not being genuine or has an agenda. And that's not what I was seeing from people like Lynn Buchanan and Paul Smith and, Hal Puthoff and so on. And even Ingo Swann, I wasn't seeing the things that I need to see to be able to say this person has an agenda other than communicating the truth to you. Okay. And that bothered me. So, that's kind of what brought me there. But here we are. There is no, as far as we know, there is no wave that travels from the marble to my wife's brain. There is no particle that travels from the marble to my wife's brain. As far as we know and as we defined it, there is no field, in the material world that connects the marble to my wife's brain. And furthermore, my wife's brain is inside of a skull. So even if there were all those things, that we would still have a hurdle to get over for my wife to be able to accurately describe this item in my pocket that she cannot see and is not aware of. So that's the first event. What happened after that is I decided that probably would have been better if it didn't work out, to be honest with you, because then I'd just have put the book down and moved on to something else. But that's not what happened. I looked at my wife, and now we did a number of other experiments, just over the next couple of hours. And I was just completely flabbergasted by what took place. I really, really kind of was freaked out for a few weeks about this, to where anybody that knows me will tell you, oh yeah, Ryan's remote viewing revelation, where I couldn't talk about anything else but this. And I'm pulling my phone out and showing people the drawings, and I'm like, but you don't understand. See how it looks like the pillow, right? But I didn't know that it was a pillow. And they're like, okay, that's interesting. I'm like, no, I must not be explaining this well enough, right? So, but fast forward. So I ended up learning remote viewing, or some of remote viewing. There's about 150 different methods. I haven't learned them all, but enough to be familiar with it. I would describe myself as better than half right, better than half the time, which is pretty good for remote viewing. It doesn't make it useful, to be honest with you. We can get into that a little bit more later if you want. And also, just because you remote viewed something doesn't mean it's true. There's a lot of that going on the internet right now, where it's like, no, but I remote viewed this. Oh, well then, then Satan must have enslaved the Asian subcontinent because you remote viewed it. When you can remote view anything. There's loads of experimental data that show, like, I could have you remote view something right now, and I could put the details in an envelope. They could all be made up details, and you'd remote view something related to those details that I put in that envelope. Wouldn't make it true, right? But anyway.
I understand where we're going here. And eventually this led you into what you're calling the information first framework of reality.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that your wife tapped into this information through remote viewing. But can you break it down for us?
A little over a year ago, I was doing a remote viewing experiment with AI. And I'll try to keep it concise, but I'm doing this experiment with AI, and I'm just seeing to what extent AI can remote view. Also, I'm seeing to what extent AI can kind of be a tasker for remote viewing. In other words, identify targets and provide you with the front loading for the targets so that you can do it, and how well it can evaluate remote viewing results. And the thing about remote viewing that fascinated me from the beginning, I didn't care about, winning the lottery. I knew that probably wasn't going to happen, and I tried, but I wasn't really looking to call the police and be like, let me help. What I wanted to know was how it worked. That was always a big driving force in my life, is I wanted to understand what it is that's happening here. What is this? Not just remote viewing, but the whole thing. And so I asked AI, I said, you have access to all the information on Earth. What do you think? How does it work? And it gave me a few, kind of canned answers to the things that, you've already heard people say. And I remembered hearing Hal Puthoff, a few years before that on a podcast, say something to the effect of, maybe remote viewing works because there's some informational aspect to the universe that we don't understand. So I said to the chatbot that I was talking to, I said, well, I've heard people say that information could be fundamental to reality. If that was the case, then how might remote viewing work then? And it came back and said, well, if information is a fundamental aspect of reality, then remote viewing isn't viewing. It's some kind of query of that information, right? So that's where this started, was with that question. And I liked the answer. I said, that's really interesting, because for the first time ever, I had a mechanism, or the start of a mechanism that could explain how this works. So after that, I started evaluating all the other interesting topics to me. So next was UAP. I said, okay, and so I ended up calling it an information first, framework, or shortly after that is what I called it. And what it says is that underlying our physical universe is the information about our physical universe. And I don't want to get too boring or off in the weeds, but if you look at quantum mechanics, anybody that ever took freshman physics at public school, back a couple chapters of the book talked about this, and they show you that double slit experiment, right? Where you shine the electrons through the two slits, and on the other side is an interference pattern, like same thing would happen if you did it with a flashlight, because it's behaving like a wave. Now, when you put another panel on the other side of that, and what that does is that causes a measurement. There is no more wave. Now we can see a particle went through one of the slits and hit that panel, right? Now we have evidence that a particle existed. So when it wasn't measured, it was a wave. When it was measured, it became a particle. Here's what that tells us. In my framework, is what it tells us. The wave is the information about the particle. And that particle does not exist in our reality yet, because it's not required. It doesn't need to be here. And when so I started with remote viewing, then went to UAP, and then went immediately to quantum mechanics. I said, okay, so now I want to evaluate quantum mechanics through this information first lens. And from there, it really showed me the whole rest of the framework came together really, really pretty easily, because what they're trying to do in physics is they're trying to figure out why, they call it a wave particle duality. They're trying to figure out why it doesn't behave like the material world does. And the reason that it doesn't is because it isn't the material world. It's the informational world underlying our reality. So what that means is that our reality is a lot more complicated than what we currently understand. So what I found, and I've always felt this way, that anomalies are like the cracks in the foundation, and if you pay attention to those, and throughout our history of science, it's always been the things that we don't understand or discount that show us what's next. And so I felt that way about, something like UAP. So if you evaluate UAP through this framework, how does it go from hovering? How does it hover in the first place? But assuming that's not the issue, how does it go from hovering a couple thousand feet over the ocean to 80,000 feet above the Earth in a fraction of a second? And, the military tells us now that they've got, we've seen the Tic Tac video, and we've heard the testimony from people who seem plenty reliable. And so we now have real confirmation that this happens. Well, that does not happen in our reality if the laws of physics as we understand them are hard and fast. It doesn't. You can't do it. There are no materials that will withstand the forces involved in that. If there's beings in those vehicles, it is not a survivable activity. It can't happen. The only way that happens is if somehow that vehicle, or whatever you want to call it, is not subject to those laws that we assume to be hard and fast about reality. Well, that's where it started kind of getting interesting, because I went and I started looking into what Gary Nolan had discovered or found when he started looking at some of these anomalous materials. And he's published some information about these. Jacques Vallée had given him some materials and said, the provenance of these is pretty good. We're pretty sure we know where these came from. You can evaluate them. And he came out and said, he did, a bunch of testing, mass spectrometry, and so on. And he did a bunch of testing on these, and he said, these are not what you'd expect to see from a wing, right? There's nothing that he found about those materials would make them fly better than, aluminum around a steel frame, and so I started looking at some of those results, and I was like, okay, well, are these similar in any way to anything else? And while I did not find that they were completely similar, I assume that these things are, in Earth years, maybe several 100,000 years ahead of us. But there were some similarities between what you would expect and what they're starting to think that some types of metamaterials might offer us in the future when we master them with regard to information handling, right? So I started thinking to myself, well, maybe this isn't a craft at all. I mean, it's a device, but maybe it's a device that can edit the rules of reality around it, right? So if the universe is fundamentally information, and that's the truth about our reality, and the beings or whatever they are from wherever they are, whatever they want, they have an understanding of this, and they have the ability to manipulate the rules of the physical universe. Well, that would be fine. That and it's harmonious with what you can definitely say by looking at the situation, which is you can't go 30,000 miles an hour in a fraction of a second and not have everything involved be atomized.
A significant number of near-death experiencers find their way into a realm where they know everything during the experience. Some people may call it the quantum hologram. Some people may label it something else. But there appears to be some field out there where all the information is. And I think that's kind of like what you're saying. But it appears to be limited to one realm. Does that make sense to you?
I've heard people say that. What you just described is completely harmonious with what I'm saying. What I call it, and I am not a woo guy. I call it an informational substrate of reality. It is the way that I envision it anyway. It isn't a place. And the information that exists there does not exist in the sense that we think of when we use words like exist. All right. It just underlies what does exist. And if you look at remote viewing, which I consider to be accessing that substrate or using that substrate to access queried information. Well, what do we know about remote viewing? And I don't know how much your audience knows about remote viewing, but I assume some. Remote viewing is noisy. It's difficult because we have brains. Our consciousness, in my framework, is an interface with the substrate. It is, for lack of a better term, on purpose. It's not an accident of chance. But it's still, it's not strictly constructed to manipulate space-time with thought, okay? So it's noisy. When you're doing a remote viewing and you say, okay, well, I see this structure here. I feel like it's wooden, right? So it's a wooden structure. But you do not see the thing. You do not know what it is, okay? We talk about it in terms of aperture, okay? It's a fairly narrow aperture that you have into that substrate to gather information about the thing. So, but what is a near-death experience? A near-death experience, what it seems to me, and in my framework, this makes sense, is it is proof that consciousness is not strictly confined to the brain in all cases. And you're talking about an NDE is inherently, that's where the D comes from. In NDE, the brain activity is minimal or not there. So here's your consciousness without your brain in the way. Well, that means you're potentially got the aperture open as wide as it could be. So access to all the information that ever existed makes complete sense. And even interacting and interfacing with, with other informational structures, other consciousnesses, and I don't really get into afterlife, and I don't know what to make of a lot of that stuff. I haven't experienced it, but I have talked to Stanley Krippner about this, and when I told him about this, I thought for sure, oh, this is somebody that can put this to rights if I'm way off base. And that's not what he did. He said, he understands a lot about NDE. And I talked to Pim Van Lommel about this too. He essentially kind of literally wrote the book on NDE. And both of them said what you're saying does offer a good explanation for this.
Many of my guests would say that everything arises from consciousness. But I believe what you're saying is that it arises from this information field, including consciousness as well, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
So how would consciousness arise from this information field instead of using it as a tool?
Right. But what's funny about this is that you would expect the parapsychology people to be the ones that look at my framework and say, ooh, this is exciting. Let's look at this. And you'd expect the hard physics people to look at what I'm saying and say, well, that's ridiculous. It's almost exactly the opposite. The physics, not completely, but the physics folks tend to be a lot more curious about it. And the parapsychology people are curious about it until they see what I say about consciousness. And then it's like, nope, you're not allowed in the cult. You're not, nope. Pull his card, revoked. Because I don't say that consciousness is fundamental. I don't see how it can be. I was talking to a fairly well-known parapsychology person, and they said, but consciousness is fundamental. I said, well, says who? First of all, I said, and second of all, did the universe non-exist for 12 billion years before a brain came along? And he I think that might have been a bit over the line. He never did respond to me after that. But no, consciousness is not fundamental. And I understand why people see it that way, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it all make sense in a material framework, right? If the universe is fundamentally space-time and matter and energy, then yeah, we do need something else to bridge this together and make it make sense. And a lot of times I think fundamentally what they do is they go to that double slit experiment and they say, oh, well, consciousness must take consciousness. It must be consciousness is everything. And if I'm watching something or reading something, and I'll look over at my wife now when somebody says, oh, it's all consciousness. And, we kind of giggle at each other because, there was a point when I might have accepted that as possible, but through an information first lens, which is still, I'm a little bit biased, but not too biased, still the best framework I've seen to explain what I see. Consciousness is an emergent structure, processing ability that is the result of a tendency toward coherent structures. It's not just an informational substrate that everything comes from. The informational substrate has a bias toward coherent structures, right? So this is why Chemicals bond. This is why, particles come together as atoms, and atoms come together as elements, and elements come together as compounds, and on and on and on. And planets come together around suns, and suns come together around black holes in the center of the universe. And beings come about from this same rule. So maybe one of the biggest things that I say in the book, the thing I'm most proud of, my contribution, I think I told you before we started that 90-something% of this book, It From Us, is the work of others, right? And what I really did was I brought them together and I said a handful of things that, near as I can tell, haven't been said. But for me, the biggest one is this. The force that, we talk about these forces in the universe, the strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, gravity, electromagnetism, and so on. Those are not different forces. Those are all examples of reality following this rule, which is the substrate's bias toward coherent structures that endure and persist. So that's not that hard to swallow. But where it really gets interesting, I guess, is that same bias towards coherence also is a part of every motivation that you and I and every other living thing ever have. Right? Look at what we do with our religions. They draw people in. They draw adherents the same way a sun draws material to it. You could argue that a great religion is inherently an informational system. And the better the informational system, the more coherent the informational situation is, or structure is, the longer it'll last, the better it'll do, the more people it'll draw to it, right? So if a planet bends space-time, to draw a moon in, a religion bends consciousness time, whatever you want to call it. And the same thing is true of civilizations. Civilizations that are informationally coherent last longer. They draw people in. They build better things. They, and on and on. So the thing that makes the Earth draw into the sun is actually the same force that makes you have a conversation with somebody and walk away saying, I like that person. It's the same thing. It's the same force or rule that causes somebody who's looking for meaning in their life to look at a particular religion and say, that resonates with me. It's the same force that causes a member of a society to say, I'm proud to be a member of this society. Or somebody to read a poem and say, that poem's beautiful. These are all the same thing. There's no such thing as gravity as we understand it. There's only bias towards coherence. And the substrate does that against the backdrop of the default state, which is entropy, which physics tells us. Gravity and all of these forces are in opposition to the entropic state, which is, I guess chaos is the colloquial way to describe it.
What happens to a person's consciousness after they die? Do they just return to the informational field and become part of it and maybe add their lifetime of information to the field?
So here's the difference between me and some people. Some people will take, information that they've gained or gathered or come to understand, and they will, want to give it a great punchline. I'm not like that. I only want, I will report what it appears to me that I've got a reasonable basis to report. I don't know what happens to us when we die. My guess is there's only probably one way to find out, because even with NDEs, if somebody has an NDE and you accept their report about what happened to them, and most of the time I think you have to accept that somebody says they had an experience, I'm going to take it at face value. Whether or not I allow it to affect my worldview is a separate issue, but I'm going to hear them out and let them, like what you do. I'm going to let them tell me what happened to them. But we don't know what a complete death experience result is, right? So it looks to me like a near-death experience is at least a temporary configuration between your consciousness and the informational substrate. I don't know what happens after you can't go back, right? But physics does tell us some interesting things. A black hole is the ultimate, just shredder of material, right? Anything that gets close enough to that black hole, I mean, there's a whole field of physics that does nothing but equations about what happens when you get a little bit closer to a black hole. Well, but what we also are pretty sure of is that a black hole does not destroy information at all. And it looks like while information can be erased, and we know that to erase information takes a measure of energy to do. So that really does make information a physical thing. But information can be erased, but it can't be destroyed. And there's not a natural process that we know of that destroys it. So if your consciousness is an informational structure, and I believe based on my research that that's what it's telling us it is, then it's completely acceptable to me that structure could go on to persist within the substrate or in some other way that doesn't exactly make sense in our physical reality.
Are you still an atheist? And if not, would you call this informational field God?
I am an atheist in the sense that I don't accept any of the religions that I know of that exist or have existed. And I don't take them as technically factual data, right? But I do see religion differently. So if you look at the bias of that substrate, it's pretty easy, I think, especially if you're a person of faith. And I've had this conversation with people of faith. They say, well, you're describing God. Okay, fair enough. Your worldview, this sounds like God. In mine, I get what you're saying. It sounds big, right? I just admitted it's responsible for the creation. Okay, so you've got this unimaginable, barely understandable force that you cannot see that is all pervasive. It is everything. It is connected to everything. And I just said it's responsible for the creation completely, remains there at all times, and biases coherence. So in other words, wants things to go well, right? Well, sure, it's easy to say, okay, that's God, and He loves you. I kind of flip it around and I look at it another way. So we're not separate in any way from this informational substrate, right? Remote viewing shows us, NDEs show us, quantum mechanics shows us that underlying everything is this accessible informational substrate. So if that's the case, then it is absolutely connected to everything. Everything comes from it, right? Not just at the particle level, but just on up from there. Every aspect of everything that exists is fundamentally connected to, because of, resulting from this underlying structure and its bias towards coherence. So while I don't call that God and accept somebody's, story about that it's God, I don't find it at all coincidental that the stories that we have throughout history, regardless of time, regardless of place, regardless of people. Everybody does this. We create stories that help us understand ontologically how it all came to be. I don't find it at all coincidental that those stories are not dissimilar from what I just described. What I wouldn't expect them to be different. I would expect them to be some kind of translation into the local, into the local understanding of the same story. But we do the human thing to it. We say, but it's, because you have to do this 3 times, and you have to do, and on the certain day you do this, and if you don't do that, you're going to hell. But if you look at what those are, really, almost every religion says the same thing at its core. And I've evaluated every one that I can find enough information on, and I have a whole chapter in a book about this. They all say 5, 6 things: treat each other well, honor what is sacred, hold together, start over. If it all comes crashing down on you, here's some guidance to start over. Take care of the people who need taken care of. Love your neighbor and be decent, basically. But what they do is they wrap them in kind of the local dogmatic sticky encoding. If we didn't do that, they wouldn't work. They wouldn't last. Without the dogma that makes somebody like me hate the religion, it never would have made it this far. And contained inside that religion is, you could argue, important survival information, persistence, coherence information that essentially comes to us from the substrate, through ourselves, through our consciousness, that helps us honor the mission that everything has.
It sounds like to me that what you're saying is things in our reality come together naturally, but they come together spontaneously. People evolve, or animals pop up, life pops up, gravity's here. But our reality is so complex. I mean, if you just take a look at a human being and all the complexities of the components of a human being and the functions of all the structures of a human being, how would all this arrive if you do believe it's spontaneous and just humans alone, much less all the other animals on this planet?
I don't know that I would use the word spontaneous. So, are you familiar with any of the work of Rupert Sheldrake?
I know of him.
I've spoken to him about my, my framework in my book, and we've had some discussion about it. And what he said, I think it was around 1980. He wrote a book called A New Science of Life, and it basically challenged the Darwinian paradigm. It said he was among the first on the scientific side of the court to say natural selection, complete, genetics, natural selection, and randomness, complete chance, doesn't really account for what we see now in the fossil record. It does not appear that there has been enough time for all the things to happen that we have evidence for. If it's just every birth is the roll of a dice, and we'll see what happens, right? And so he proposed something that he calls a morphic field. Think of it as like a structure or a membrane of memory that living things are in some kind of communion with, right? So I'm probably not doing his work justice. I mean, he's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. But what he says is harmonious with my framework. So what he's saying essentially is that, the reason you see wings in bats and birds and bugs, even though these things are not close together evolutionarily, right? They wouldn't be considered from the same line of evolution. The reason that you see it is because if it worked over here, somewhere it's known that it will work in this case as well, right? That information is somehow available for future iterations. And I agree with I essentially agree with him. I just don't think it's limited to biology. I think that all things. But if you follow this logic that there's a substrate bias toward coherence, and you look at evolution, and you really break it down, genetics is an informational code, and evolution is a mathematical algorithm. Right? Both of these things meet the raw definition of each of those. So evolution is the process by which endurance and coherence mechanisms are tested for, are road tested for validity. And once that validity is known, the information exists. There's lots of studies about this. If you teach rats to do something in Zimbabwe, and then you evaluate whether they can do it in Nebraska. They can do it faster in Nebraska after it's been taught to them in Zimbabwe, right? It's just like Dean Radin's work with all the random number generators and stuff. I mean, no scientific field has been put through the kind of exhaustive rigor that some of these quote unquote fringe theories have been. They are tested, they are proven, they are factual. We just don't understand why. But hopefully that gets at your question. I don't call it random and I don't call it spontaneous. I think it is the universe unfolding along the arc of the trajectory of this bias towards coherence. I think UAP are showing us where that goes for us, where this trajectory takes us if we can get our act together and start. I never would have thought in my life that I would be saying this, but if we could stop arguing about the dogmatic wrappers around our religions and accept the truth of what they're telling us, look up and accept the truth of what they're telling us, there's an unbelievable reality waiting for us if we could ever do that.
How does information from the field decide that it's going to become a tree, or it's going to become a lake, or it's going to become a dog? Do you have any idea of what that mechanism is, that it takes the raw data from the information field and becomes something, and why?
Well, yeah, I don't think that the field is necessarily behaving in that way. Like I have some theories, and I promised you when we started that I would not get all sciencey McSciencers and and put everybody to sleep. So I'm not going to do that. But like I have in the book, I theorize how the Big Bang may have happened and why. Okay. All there needs to be is that bias and the beginning. Once those things are established or accepted, really, everything else really does make sense. The substrate does not need to do anything to the acorn right now. The acorn is following the rules. It's following the rules established by the substrate. It knows what to do. And in fact, further evidence that information is the pervasive thing here. Inside that acorn is all the information necessary to be a sequoia that lives 1,000 years, right? So I get the question. I don't know that it might just be me. I don't know that I need it to necessarily resolve quite that crisply. But yeah, I think that once the thing got going, and it got going per these rules, I think everything else that happens as a result of that, like my Big Bang isn't an explosion; it's a cascade that's still taking place, right? And it's why I don't think there's dark matter. I don't think there's dark energy. I think that, in fact, probably what we're going to find is that what we consider to be hard and fast rules everywhere are a little more malleable in different places, based on where where the creation is there in relationship to the ongoing cascade.
Well, in your viewpoint, what started the Big Bang in the first place?
Oh, so you asked for it, right?
I did.
I'm happy to do it. So if you look at information theory, and I'm talking about people like Claude Shannon, and if you really want to go down a rabbit hole, Google Claude Shannon. But these were guys in the 50s and 60s, and they were trying to understand how electrons and wires worked. Like how are we going to do communication? They really established a lot of the groundwork for the world we live in today. But they were trying to understand, okay, well, what is information? And some of those guys were saying things like, well, information fundamentally is the difference between things. So, the information about this cup is inherently how I describe the cup in relationship to other things, right? It's round. Well, something can't be round unless other than round exists. Does that make sense? So I envision or theorize that prior to the universe coming into existence, there was nothing. Like a lot of people think, oh, the Big Bang, and what came before the Big Bang? Nothing. There was nothing. There was no creation. There was no time. There was no space. There was no material. And this is where my Big Bang theory differs from current models. When it was explained to me, I envisioned like a bowling ball, and it was, but this contained all the matter in the universe. Well, that's preposterous, obviously. But in my Big Bang or Big Cascade or whatever you want to call it, there was absolutely nothing. And I trapped myself in a paradox as soon as I started thinking about this. I said, but if there's nothing, then there's nothing to compare it to. There can't be, you're wrong, Ryan. The universe can't be based on information because prior to anything existing, information couldn't exist. Unless, and I'm out on a limb here, I accept that, but unless it was possible for the universe to come into existence. If that was possible, then that represents a difference between the default state at that time, which was no existence. So because there was nothing, but there could be something, we get the instantiation of particles and space and time in a cascade, much like you get the instantiation of a particle from the wave function prior to being measured. The fact that there could be a universe instantiated the universe from nothing, and that the pre-existence state of nothing, I call the entropic tendency. That's the backdrop was nothing, right? And then here you've got something, and it's this informational configuration that favors coherence, and that's everything ever since. Is we're doing it in our own lives, and the planet we're on does it, and the particles that we observe do it. They're following this bias and trying to hold things together against the alternative, which is nothing.
Is it possible that what we really live in is a simulation, and that's why you think everything comes from information?
I think that it's possible. I don't think that it's likely, but I can see how we could arrive at looking at it that way. But that in and of itself is, again, trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense. But it's a material first lens, right? Oh, well, none of this stuff makes sense unless it's all a simulation. Unless the reality, which is not a lot different than what I'm saying. I'm saying reality has a deeper level than what we think it does. But I think what simulation theory is saying, that reality isn't real. Well, maybe I'm simple, but just like I say, all the material in the universe can't fit into a space the size of a bowling ball. You couldn't have a simulation that that allowed me to be real to myself, right? I don't think that you could do that. And in an information first framework, it's not necessary. Guys like Donald Hoffman, who are like, oh, that's what it is. We're living in a simulation, and so, some of these things that he says, like if you saw the real reality, it would kill you. Okay, maybe that's a clickbait thing, but how do you know? Where is it? What's the evidence of that? And what I'm, maybe I don't know, maybe you got to read my book to see really what the biggest differences are. But my framework has a reality. It's real. It doesn't require multiple universes. It doesn't require strings, accounting for electrons that you can't see, because the electron isn't, you're not seeing it because it isn't an electron yet. I have worked out the number of core assumptions required for most of the known, ontology frameworks that we currently are working on. Okay. General relativity requires 6 assumptions. So things that we do not know to be fact, it requires us to assume that they are, like space and time are a fabric. Gravity is a bending. The speed of light is constant. We don't know any of these things to be true. Okay. Quantum mechanics requires 8 assumptions. What we call the standard model of physics requires 7. Dark matter requires 9. Dark energy requires 10. Inflation theory requires 11. String theory requires at least 12. Consciousness as fundamental, or idealism, we discussed, that requires 5. Panpsychism, which is kind of less of it kind of fits into the last one. Simulation theory requires at least 5. Information first requires 1 or 2, depending on how you define what an assumption is. Information is the foundation of everything. Matter, energy, consciousness, everything else are all expressions of informational patterns. And physical laws are simply stable information structures that persist against along the bias. So a lot of those other things, I get where we got them, and the reason they require so many assumptions is because they're trying to make it all fit into the universe that we can see. And what I'm saying is that the universe that we can see is not the whole story.
How do we take all the information you've given us today and apply it to our lives for our benefit?
If you're somebody like me, and as somebody that studied religion and looks at what's going on in the world, all over the world today, we're really having a hard time with meaning. You and I discussed this too. Like, if you look at the behavior of people around these anomalous topics, like, I said online that I thought the Boogosphere was a hoax. Might not be, but I think it is. And the vitriol that people came at me with over that is worse than times that I've gone online and said Christianity is made up, right? Because I think that people are gravitating towards anything that they can believe, and frankly, today's world, for a lot of people, I think the Boogosphere is a lot more believable than Jesus or Muhammad, right? We're in a crisis of meaning. So I was in that same crisis before this happened. But think about this. Think about science and religion, us possibly being at a time where, in the not too distant future, science and religion are basically going to be in complete agreement. Now, they may not use the same language. I do think that we're to the place where we need to be per the unfolding plan of the substrate, that we can identify that the dogma is no longer all that helpful. Excuse me, and let it start to go. But science has been the enemy of religion because it doesn't address meaning. Religion has been the enemy of science because it doesn't address facts. But in an information first framework, these two things have the potential to come, I say, back together, because 5,000 years ago, priest and scientist was the same job. A shaman was both of those things. And I think we could get there again. I mean, and maybe we've got many generations left of people who need it to be, a creator with a personality and those traits. Maybe we're not as close as I hope we are, but a substrate with a bias might not sound as sexy, but it is the same thing. It means that there is a meaning. It means that meaning has meaning. And I think that just right off the bat opens up a lot of possibilities. But there's another side to this too. I believe if I'm right, and a civilization starts down the path of understanding this way and ends up doing the things that we see UAP do or that they're reported to do, it means that I was talking to a friend of mine today, and he's not too familiar with the framework, and he's trying to get the Reader's Digest version. He wants it out of me in 5 minutes. And I said, but you don't understand. I just told you gravity doesn't exist fundamentally. He's like, right. I said, what does that mean? He's like, it means that. I said, it means we don't need trucks. He goes, it means we don't need trucks. It means that we don't need 15 or 20 countries holding 190 or 200 countries hostage over this liquid we pump out of the ground and set on fire. It means, you open up Pandora's box there, and I kind of think maybe my next book is just about this. The technologies that we will develop as a result of understanding the true nature of reality are going to render almost all the problems that we perceive right now non-issues, right? When you can take something from 0 miles an hour to 30,000 miles an hour in a fraction of a second, you do not need petroleum and you do not need trucks. Our carbon footprint, or for that matter, you don't need wires. If quantum entanglement tells us that information can exist in two places at the same time instantaneously, transfer is not necessary. Which, if you took all the energy, out of the equation that we use just to move electrons from one point to another, to share information from one place to another, it's like 20% or more of our carbon footprint. If you take moving things from point A to point B, you probably knock that down to low tens of the percentage that we use now to do it. Basically, our carbon footprint goes from all that to keeping things cold.
Are you a fan of Star Trek, especially The Next Generation?
I did watch it a lot when I was a kid, but I wouldn't say that I'm more of a Star Wars guy. I want the music and the drama and the good versus evil.
Well, my point is that a potential application of what you're saying is whatever that piece of equipment that they would have on the ship, where they could just make something out of thin air. Like they would say, computer, give me a cup of hot tea. And it would just take information and have the glass and the tea there for you.
Yeah, well, look at any of the meta-analysis that Gary Nolan did on any of the UAP materials. Look at, don't look at any one, but look at many and take them all together. Craft with no rivets. And you tell me how they made it. I think you just did tell me how they made it. I think you're right. I think there is I could be wrong. I'm waiting for somebody to come and explain a simple math equation to me that says I'm wrong. I've been waiting for that around the corner the whole time. It hasn't happened yet. But if I'm not wrong, then it means that all the things that we just discussed are the tip of the iceberg. It means you can go anywhere. You can do anything. You can see and experience anything. It might even mean, I mean, there might be whole civilizations native to the substrate, right? Like they said, we're going to take the permanent NDE, which just opens up all kinds of explanations for lots of things that we see that we can't explain. But I mean, but I try to look at it, okay, well, temper your expectations. What would it mean for us on Earth as we are? I think it would mean that if you looked at it right and really got the thing on a solid foundation, shared it with people so they could understand it, I think it means that we might have a number of really good reasons to put our swords down and get to work.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface of your book. So what is the title and where can people go to learn more about it?
The title is It From Us, An Information First Framework and the Purpose of Consciousness. It's not out yet. It's almost done. I'm talking to publishers. If you're a publisher, I want to talk to you, but don't come to me with a deal. I'm not interested. I know where to get books printed. That's not the part I need help with. But you can go to the website for the book and the discussion and the project. It's itfromus.com. And from there, you can get all of the social medias. I've done a couple of articles in Ancient Origins. Just had one come out in the Greek Reporter. I've got another article coming out in the International Remote Viewing Association, puts out a quarterly magazine called Aperture. And I've got an article coming out in that. I don't even think you need to be a member to read that. You just go to the irva.org, and when that's out, you can read it. But it explains how, in an information first framework, the functionality, psychic functionality is explainable. So there's lots of places that you can kind of get into with Substack and Medium and so on. But yeah, the book isn't quite out yet. So, and I understand if people maybe are a little bit frustrated with me on some of those outlets. They get into asking me lots of questions, but what about? And I'm like, well, I promised to answer it in the book.
If people do want to reach out to you and ask you questions, are you open to that? And if so, how do they contact you?
Yeah, let's do it somewhere that, if you have a show or something and you want to have me on it, you can email me or whatever, but if you just have a question and you want to talk about it, let's do that somewhere that people do that. I like Substack the best, frankly, because you can get into the articles and really kind of see for yourself what it kind of looks like, and then you can ask me questions right there, if that's helpful. I don't spend a lot of time on the hard social medias like Twitter and stuff like that. There's a YouTube channel where we put out these like 3-minute videos that kind of follow the arc of the book. Just wet your whistle, make the publishers happy that you're doing something, kind of thing. But Substack is probably where I end up doing the most kind of deep engagement with people that are curious.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
We can do this. Not just this, not information first, all of it. We can do all the things that we all say would make the world a better place. We can do them, but we can't do them if we keep being victimized by the information age. We're all being victimized by the information age. We've got these tremendous devices with these tremendous capabilities, but we're arguing with each other over which presidential candidate is the most inept. We can do better than this, but it takes leadership. You have to do it. It takes your own leadership of your own life first, but it takes leadership of institutions, and you have to love your neighbor. If you don't love your neighbor and treat them well, nothing's going to go good. History has taught us that. The substrate demands it. Every religion demands it. Let's start doing these things instead of arguing about who's not doing them worse.
Ryan, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.